So what are discos? Discos are cultural and structural. Should I get over here? Yeah. There are a set of tools and practices for people to create value together, to work together in cooperative, commons-oriented, and feminist economic forms. And Disco, being distributed cooperative organizations, embed a critique and also an alternate reality view of DAOs. So imagine a reality where DAOs had not been so much programmed by a white tech elite with their privileges, but by other people, by other sensitivities. So this is Disco's. We can leverage a lot of critique towards DAOs, and some of them have been spoken this morning. This lack of inclusivity, the fact that the messy stuff, the soft stuff is the hard stuff, the felt dimension, etc. And I'd like to point out one that was beautifully expressed by our colleague Primavera De Filippi back in 2014 in an article called Ethereum, Freenet or Skynet. Skynet, if you're not familiar, is the supercomputer that nukes the planet Earth in the Terminator franchise. And she said, well, if you think about a decentralized system that can execute smart contracts autonomously, and if you exacerbate that with the investments that are being made in artificial intelligence, machine learning, imagine that a totalitarian state or a corporate oligarchy programs such a DAO to forward their interests. And yeah, this is kind of like a scary apocalyptic scenario, but if you take a look at history and how the triarchy of centralization and hierarchy, which is the patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism, has used technology to further its ends, and you start thinking about some of the investors in machine learning and blockchain technology like IBM, you can see that this scenario has become somewhat worrying. So we need to create a contrast for that, and Disco is one of the contrasts that we can have. So the Disco DNA has four main components. And the first of this is the commons. We hear a lot of talk about the commons, but I think that there's a lack of clarity. I'll give you like super snippet view of the commons. The commons are living systems to meet shared needs. Okay? And they're characterized usually by a community that gathers around the resource and governs this resource through their own protocols, not the protocols of the market, not the protocols of the state. The commons is also like a conversation between the past, the present, and the future, between the human and the non-human world, and between communities, small and large. We can think about the commons as like the default mode of social organization. This brings in indigenous cultures, the river is me and I am the river, this kind of things that we've been talking about. The second part of the DNA is open cooperativism, which kind of coalesces the practices of the cooperative movement with open source culture, with the commons, platform co-ops, which is democratizing the decision-making and the governance of the platforms that increasingly mediate our daily lives. The third influence is called open value accounting, and this is something that precedes the blockchain, but which was being done in the P2P space, where you gain value sovereignty by tallying contributions. So someone contributes to a project, this is how they get rewarded instead of using wage labor. And the fourth influence is feminist economics, which question normative abstractions of value and which speak directly about care work and reproductive work. All of these four components don't necessarily talk to each other. And some of them, especially feminist economics, are very much absent in the blockchain space. And I think that's quite concerning because for a movement that speaks so much of decentralization, if you're not decentralizing power, if you're not decentralizing established cultural hierarchies, you're not decentralizing very much. So important lessons from the commons, feminist economics, etc. Discourse are also supposed to be an educational field. Someone spoke earlier about the inaccessibility of the blockchain. And I think that it is a responsibility for those of us who are proposing other solutions to take the time to onboard people, to make them part of this, not just merely followers. And Discos didn't arise, they don't come from a white paper culture. They actually arose from a community of practice. And this is the Guerrilla Media Collective, Guerrilla Translation. So this is a co-op which has a highly developed governance model, which is also the Disco governance model, where we track three types of value. So we track pro bono work. Okay, so part of it is translation. So imagine that I do a pro bono translation for Ella, okay? And we tally that in value. But we're also an agency. So we track what we call livelihood work. So we get paid work from Phoebe, okay? We track that. Now, when we get paid, 25% of the value goes to Ella. But there's a third type of value, which is care work. Now, care work is very hard to measure, but we do have some indicators on how to do this. Yes, can you hear me right? Hello? Okay. DGOVs are also based on 7 principles. Now, if you're familiar with co-ops, okay, so who's familiar with the concept of care work? Okay. If we had more time, I would give you the mic. But basically, care work is all the invisible work that goes, it's what's externalized from the production processes. So for example, in the value system, we just value monetary outputs. But who's creating the workforce? It's usually women, rearing children, etc. Who's taking care? I'll give you another example. Like when we talk about P2P, people usually think about technological topologies, okay, networks of computers. But behind those computers, there are bodies. There are people with affections that need to be nourished, etc. That is the domain of care work, which is strangely absent from our mainstream economics and also from the DAO space. How much time do I have left, folks? 3 minutes. Okay. So I'll run through the 7 DGOV principles, which build on the existing 7 cooperative principles. The first one is that they must be oriented towards social and environmental ends, meaning what are you doing with your productivity, what are you doing with your time, do something useful for the massive predicaments that we have. Second, they're multi-constituent. I prefer constituent instead of stakeholder in nature. And this basically means enfranchising everyone in the value chain to have a vote. DGOVs are also active creators of commons. They don't take from the commons, like IBM taking from the code to build surveillance machines. They actually give back to the commons. The fourth is that they're transnational in nature. Many of the challenges that we face are transnational and incurred by corporations who don't care so much about borders. So I think that we also need that dimension. The fifth principle is that they're predicated on care work. The sixth is that they reimagine notions of value with these 3 types of value tracking that I've told you about: care work, livelihood, and pro bono. And the final one is that they're designed to be federated. And placing high value on personal relationships, the particular Damba number for DGOV is actually 15 people. Because this is the way that you can have meaningful relationships. But this can be federated, and we can have economic mutualization. More on the structural sense, trust being a hot potato on the DLT world. We actually took a cue from community land trusts. I don't know how familiar you are. Do you know what community land trusts are? Okay, so for those of you who may not be, this is when a group of people have a piece of land and they put together a contract that says this land will be used for social purposes. So the land cannot be taken away for market interests. So we came up with something called a DGOV cat, as in meow cat. This is the community algorithmic trust, and this is the heart of the DGOV. This is what resides on change, meaning these cultural processes, things like we've seen in Inspiral, they're deposited in this trust, but they're not merely executed by the machine. And this is where I differ with some of the vision that you've explained. We cannot get away from the messy human processes of having conversations. We just cannot have the machine be the bad cop, because it's also a beautiful process and it's a maturing process. What is the key of that? It's not scalability, it's federation, it's crystallization. I could go on for hours, but we can have a chat afterwards and I can point you to some resources. And I'm very happy to be working with Phoebe and with Ella and with our colleague Ruth Catlow and several other people on developing this. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to you went quickly through feminist economics. Could you just like clarify again, because I didn't get it.
Feminist economics question the abstractions of value that we have today. Okay, so like I've mentioned before, monetary value, certain kinds of productivity are very much valued, but you don't take a look behind the curtain. What does it take? What does it take for people to be productive according to these metrics? It's a form of externalization. So we often talk about environmental externalities. This doesn't count for the market, you know, we just dump this. And this is dealt by an increasingly absentee state. It's the same with care work, but it's even more invisible. So feminist economics is a discipline which quite a large body of literature by now that can help assist this. And I think that it's especially incumbent in the DAO space. So I would encourage you to look more into it.
I think you mentioned the term economic mutualism between federated DAOs. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, mutualization is like once you take stock of like your value flows and your liquidity, and if you have like a good communication system, you can identify needs and you can identify. I mean, I'll give you like a micro example, which would be co-budgeting in Spiral. Okay, so when they have certain surpluses, they nominate pots. It's like, so, okay, so I'm going to propose a project. There's also like this co-op in England called Outlandish. They do the same. So what crypto would allow us to do is to have this sort of mutualization beyond the fiat currencies of like a particular legislation. Okay?
I have a question around the federation strategy, because you say 15 people is a good number of people to 15, right? But still, I wonder, there must be more advantages to the federation. So why do you think it's elementary for Discos?
I think it's elemental because processes are not linear, and the more diversity that you can have in a system, the more resilience. Now, this puts the onus on those designing the system to prioritize clear communications and ways to channel all these influences together. 15 is a good number for what we would call like the most basic crew. This is the people that you're working with day by day. But I'll give you an example. In Guerrilla Media Collective, right now, we're 3 nodes. So there's a node doing translation, there's another one doing graphic design, and there's another one doing marketing, but we hate that word, so we called it agitprop. And so, like, within the individual Discord, you have these nodes, but I think it depends on the rhythms. So you can have like a daily rhythm, a daily check-in with the people who are closest to you, with who you will have the most intimate connections. But then you can have like a weekly check-in with the rest of the co-op. You can have a monthly check-in with other Discords, with other platform co-ops, etc. And I think this kind of like rhythms, you cannot have the full flow of information at the same level between the nodes, but you have to taper it. And you have to like identify the patterns which are more useful at the large scale. And it also comes from the cooperative tradition, and there's also like a strong political tradition of federation, which I think can infuse the DAO world.
Thank you so much, and I've just had so much fun reading all the stuff that you've been putting out around this, and I just wonder about the question of replication. One of the ideas behind DAOs is that, okay, it's all in the software, so that dream of you replicating the organization with the click of a button. You've done so much work to build the Guerrilla Media Collective, to do the deep exploration, to develop this model and to make it function for you, and then are now promoting it as a model. How much do you expect that other groups are going to have to go through the same process that you went through, as opposed to being able to, deploy these kinds of organizations more easily because of the work you've done?
I think that's a huge fallacy, meaning like you can copy the code, you will have essentially this organization. And even when you're documenting practices, like in Spiral, it's not good enough to document. It's not good enough to open source. You need to curate, you need to create narrative. So we're hopefully compiling a really good narrative, but people don't have to follow it. You have to figure it out. You have to do your own processes. You have to be really transparent with your mistakes, and you can see like other people's mistakes. But to me, like the surprise here, I wouldn't want to see like the Guerrilla Media Collective like experience like photocopy. That's like incredibly boring. We want to see how the specificity and the challenges of like other co-ops can take on this model and come up with new solutions that can feed back. And it's a slow process. It's like, sorry, there's no cloning and there's not that kind of replicability. Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stacco. It's great to have a peer-to-peer commons presence here. And so to weave that now with the new DAO tech paradigm, we have Felipe Duarte from DAOstack. Do you want to come and set up your laptop while I introduce you? So Felipe, are you the ecosystem? What are you at DAOstack?
I'm the weird guy that showed up. I'm going to tell this story.
Okay, we got to wait for the story.
Communications Project X.
Communications Project X, and Felipe is from Brazil. These are the things I know about Felipe. It'll be great to hear your point of view on DAOstack and the experience of that so far.